Hello, friends in history, and welcome to this live stream review on teaching the global Middle Ages. So, thank you for joining me. There's a poll question or two there, so I can kind of see who's here and adapt to your needs. And I very much want for this session to be interactive from both students and teachers. Whoever's here, what kinds of things are you thinking about? What can you add to how we can cover the Middle Ages in a truly global fashion? This isn't meant to be prescriptive in the sense that these just be some ideas and some ways of approaching things, but you'll notice the call to action button, the green button there, has a link to the Global Middle Ages project, which has a lot of resources, and there's also maybe 7, 8 resources there linked in the stream that I'll refer to throughout the review here. So if you could take a moment to fill in the poll, maybe let me know how your first week in September is going. First week in school here for us in Minnesota, or at least for most Minnesotans. So I'm still getting to know my students. You can just let me know what's happening. One thing from school in the chat, so I know that you all can hear me. It's always something of a mystery. It's like ordering a school bus for a field trip. You're always hoping it's going to happen. You can also park questions in the ask a question here. Board. Good. All right. So we have some students. We have some people who have been in school for more than a couple of weeks. Current students out there as well. Okay. So maybe just a thumbs up in the chat if you can hear me. I can tell you can see things. I'll share my screen. Right. So this is our presentation for tonight. Great. Thank you, Mrs. L. I appreciate that. So this is meant, oh, Gracie, I appreciate it. Wow, yeah, I know. I was thinking of that, Vanessa, in terms of I'm coordinating streams for the AP World, and so we have some with study skills coming up this week, and there's students who are going to have midterms, and then other students who like just checked out. My kids just checked out their book today, so people are in all different kinds of places on this journey here. So this is Think Fiveable. And if you're not familiar, it's the social learning platform. So we hope to learn from each other in the chat with presenters providing content that's of use for students and teachers in the different subjects. You can follow on all the social media platforms. Last year, there were a few subjects on Fiveable, but this year we're up to 19. And there are multiple streams now happening every night. So there's 2 or 3 happening. There's one other one happening right now and a couple others at different times. In world history, we have a few coming up this week. A couple are student-led streams. So if there's students there, Skylar Walters is doing this stream tomorrow night at 6 p.m. Eastern on taking notes. And she's a student who studied on her own for the AP World Test as a 9th grader and got a 5. So her advice on taking notes would be, very worthwhile. And then she'll be back on Friday with another student who is also successful as a 9th grader. And that study group will be for students. So teachers, you can let your kids know, or students in the stream, or you can just ask questions for Skylar, and Varun Koditala will be the other streamer there. Both excellent students, and they'll be there to answer questions. If people have projects or tests coming up, they can ask about that. Tomorrow night, streaming from the Pacific, James Zucker, who's a teacher in LA, will talk about the historical developments and processes. That is one of the historical thinking skills. It's one of the things that is assessed on the AP test. It's one of the things history teachers teach. So kind of what does that mean? It's fancy, but it's basically it sounds fancy, but identify and explain, and how can you work on that skill. And then Carolyn Castellanos will be talking about annotating primary sources on Saturday. So that's just this week, and we'll have another slate of about 10 next week. All right. So welcome, folks, as you're coming in. If you could take the poll, and if you have any questions, things that you'd like to talk about, you can park them there in the Ask a Question tab. I'm going to start. Oh, there we are. Just introduce myself a little bit. I mentioned my position here. This is my 30th year teaching, and about half that time I've taught AP history. In terms of what I see as my role in the profession right now, it is really to help decolonize, like removing Eurocentrism and legacy practices from world history and globalizing the content. And so I plan to do a stream once a month. I'll be coordinating the other streams, and I sit in on them. You might have seen me in the chat and some of the other streams, and I'm learning a lot from the people I'm working with. But my streams will be once a month on the second Wednesday, so starting in 5 weeks, and then the second Wednesday, looking at decolonizing, globalizing curriculum. So just working through the curriculum. So that's going to be what I'll be doing here. And if you're interested in keeping up or being in touch with me, I tweet kind of a lot at Beckman, and then I also have thoughts on my personal blog. I've written a few things for the Fiveable articles as well, but the things on my blog are, if they're going to be more pointed or more personal, I put them there. So I wrote a little bit recently about how Fiveable fits in with what I have going on in the rest of my life and my career. So you can check that out if you want. All right. Let's go ahead and get started. I have a text for us to look at to begin here. Take a minute to read that. And what I'd like people to do, you can just pop it in the chat, is guess the region, kind of general part of the world, that this text is about. And I've taken out the specific names because those would, be big hints, perhaps, at least the language. So I'll give you a moment. It's talking about how a primary source, another source. So the historian was looking at 3 different sources, and then this was the conclusion. This is a secondary source article from a historical journal. Let's take a guess in the chat. Where do you think this is from? It's describing like the 14th century, a place in the 14th century. Right. Any guesses? Someone want to put in where do they think it's from? You might sense that it's from one region, but not be sure. That's all right. Just a way to think and interact here. So describing a decentralized situation where the ruler is claiming sovereignty, but there's a fair bit of independence. I mean, that's what's happening here in this text. All right. Thank you, Mrs. L, for guessing. Places here. Right. Another good guess. Thank you, Genevieve. Oh, yeah, spelling. No, that's all right. Thank you. So this is describing Java. And I think any guess would be fine, because my point in putting this up here is that this sort of general description fits a lot of parts of the world. And in European history, and then European history that influences world history, a lot of attention gets paid to feudalism or what's called feudalism in Europe. But if you look at it from a world history perspective, the general relationships that it's describing could fit a lot of different places. Now, this Kenneth Hall is an expert on medieval Java and Southeast Asia, and I'm sure he could explain to us how Java is different from Mesoamerica and the Indian subcontinent and Western Europe and China during this time period. And those things are real. Those are real differences and distinctions. But when we're surveying this region, I think it's important, or surveying the world in this time period, I think it's important to keep in mind that we don't need to go into a lot of detail about the social systems in all of the places. So here's what I have laid out for us tonight, 5 sections to do. The first is a scholarly idea, this idea of the global Middle Ages, and then kind of looking at as a framework, and then looking at what do we need to avoid, or what do I suggest people avoid when they're learning about or talking about the Middle Ages. And then the other three are ways to globalize the class. So decolonizing is the idea of taking out the Eurocentric frame from the course, and then globalizing is the idea of then how do we cover all parts of the world. So this idea of a global Middle Ages is a phrase that's been used by some collaborative medievalists, and the hashtag there, is it's not super active on Twitter, but I have found a number of good resources that I'm going to share tonight. I have found following that hashtag, and two Twitter follows that who I like a lot. Although, oops, I misspelled Monica there. It's Monica Green, not Monica. I will fix that. Um, is a medievalist who studies the bubonic plague. And I think that's an interesting topic, like the Black Death of the 14th century. And that's an interesting topic to talk to our students about, or for students to think about in terms of how history is changing, like how our understanding of the past changes. Because the understanding of the Black Death has changed a lot because of new tools in genetics and DNA sequencing, where there's been a lot that's been learned about the Black Death as a result of being able to study the bacterium, the pestis that causes it. But she also tweets a lot of other kind of global things and retweets some pretty interesting stuff, and is a pretty good follow, I think. And I also really like the medieval Indonesia, who sort of a nameless person, is a grad student. Well, the person has a name, but they tweet under this Indonesian name, and then under as medieval Indonesia. But it's a grad student. It's a he him and grad student, and a lot of very interesting things about the Middle Ages. And so this is a phrase that medievalists have used as a way to try to globalize their own practice. I mentioned here this project. That's the call to action button if you want to check that out. And if you take a look at this text, I think one thing that I noticed when I read this, I read some articles here to kind of see what did academics mean by the global Middle Ages, and this is from 4 or 5 years ago. Well, really, it was 2015, but it was from some workshops that were 5, 7 years ago. Their premise that the medieval period has the potential to shape central debates within the broader field of global history, while at the same time being enriched itself by global perspectives. In some ways, this is medieval historians kind of catching up with AP World History, which has always had this world or global history frame. But the work that some people are doing under this banner is very helpful for helping history teachers, history students see connections between different parts of the world. And I think that'll become a little more clear when we look at some examples here. But this idea of a global Middle Ages is a good phrase or term to have in mind for teachers looking for resources, or students if you're doing a project and you're looking to find something that's sort of up to date, and fits in with a world history theme. So, how do we get to presenting the Middle Ages in a way that's global and inclusive? Well, the first thing we need to do is problematize the idea that Middle Ages means European. So, I tell people, or if I told somebody, just a casual friend, or casual history person, maybe they might be a close friend, that I'm doing a presentation on the Middle Ages, they quite often would talk about European things. But as we see here in the picture of St. Maurice, medieval Europeans maybe saw themselves more globally than perhaps people looking back on medieval Europe see see that time period. And then there's also the issue of legacy practices. The original historians in Europe, like from the 19th century, when I say original, I mean they kind of formed the modern practice of history. Were looking a lot of times at the Middle Ages for nationalist purposes. And so, in this way, the idea of Western civilization was actually anti nationalist or anti racist because Western civ was the idea that the whole of Western Europe shared a common heritage instead of these narrow histories. So, it's kind of anti Nazi. But over time, what was progressive in, say, 1900, 1910 isn't so much anymore. So, we have kind of two issues here. The first one is that the Middle Ages weren't white. And the second problem is that different kinds of racist nationalists in Europe and also broader white nationalists use the Middle Ages as a tool to promote their cause. So that's one of the things that we need to be aware of. And as students, for students who are tuning in here, to know that the Middle Ages, even in Europe, wasn't exclusively white. That's an important thing to know. It's also exciting because it opens up this very interesting time period to all kinds of perspectives and ideas. One way to think of this period, again, this is overview for students, is that at the end of the Middle Ages, or say around 1400, according to Robert Marx, who's a historian, who's written some important world history books. You're looking at population and economy, like Europe, India, China are all about 1/4 of the world. This is roughly 1/4 of the world. So that's all of Europe, all of South Asia, all of China. There's each about 1/4 of the world. And then the rest of the world is the remaining quarter. So we have to keep that in mind as well. And the reason why this is important to note is because teachers so often have had more training in, or our own background is in European based history, we tend to know those events in greater detail. So what granularity here means is we're treating those events in greater detail than events from other places. So any kind of detail that we go into for Europe, we really should be looking at the same kind of detail for China and India, is what I'm saying. And so I think that that's going to mean for a lot of people to do more detail in those other places and less detail in Europe. A great place to look at this, I'm not going to talk about the Renaissance tonight, but that's a hot topic with this. But I really recommend people check out Bram Hubbell's blog posts on this at Liberating Narratives. They're in the resources. Here's a more humorous and pointed way to look at it. I want you to just peek at this here for a sec. If you click on this, the tweets they're all so funny. This is from when the Ariel casting from the new Little Mermaid movie came out. So I mean, they're all pretty funny with that. Medieval people didn't really think in terms of race. We saw a black Saint Maurice back there, somebody from Africa, but Saint Maurice, the saint in classical times, is from Egypt. But that doesn't mean people put people into categories that way or saw mermaids as people that had races and things like that. So, recommend you check that out. Another topic then that we may kind of think about here is how feudalism gets presented in classes. And this is again either teachers how you might present this or students how you're learning about it. And on the right is how feudalism is often presented. It's actually a picture from a wall at the castle of Lincoln Castle in England. A diagram of that. But then on the left is an image that an actual medievalist, someone who studies medieval Europe, shared with me, or not just me, but with a group at a workshop, Dr. Phil Adamo, and he studies medieval history. He said medieval people looked at themselves more this way, that these three orders weren't necessarily hierarchical. And one of the things that I think teachers should be aware of is Like the reason I showed that secondary source at the beginning is I don't think we need to go into too much depth on feudalism because it's the basic situation where things are decentralized and there's a lot of personal relationships. That's generally true throughout the world. So I think we can just note that. Medievalists, people who actually study this period, started discarding the idea of a feudal system like 40 some years ago. And so the idea that there's a feudal system with a easily diagrammable relationship between people that's similar in different parts of Europe, that basically only exists in secondary school textbooks. But when we're looking at this period, then we need to emphasize that there was a lot of complexity. Things were for people who were in the middle of the feudal relationships, they had connection to a lot of different people who were vassals. These that were they were vassals for a lot of different people. They had a lot of different um they had a lot of different lords. They were lords to a lot of different people. It's very complex, and then it's very different all over the place. One way to think about this is any description that we would give of feudalism that's broad enough to encompass, say, all of Western Europe is probably also true for huge chunks of the rest of the world. And then if we get more specific, which is what an actual historian would do to look at how in things specifically, well, then you're going to have local variations, both within and between Europe and other places. So what I've taken to doing is talking about feudal relationships because students need to know this term. It does come up, and it's a term that Karl Marx uses, and so then Marxists talk about it. But the Marxists will in China will talk about feudalism in China, which is a system that's theoretically highly centralized, even though in effect it wasn't at the end of its life. The imperial dynastic system, and then into the republic, and then the Marxists are talking about feudalism. So I think what kids need to know about is feudal relationships and what that means. So if you're a student out there, what we're talking about, feudal comes from an Italian word that means contract. And so it's the idea that people are exchanging service of some kind. That could be labor service in exchange for some protection or land. So these exchanges are happening. So it's inherently decentralized. What I'm saying is, for students, you don't have to know all the details of that. Well, you could for some area, because the general frame of it around the world is what's important. So I think that the primary sources, and I tacked one on the end of this presentation that's shared if you want to take a look at it. One that I use, it tells a story. You have to kind of read it a couple of times to figure out what's happening, where someone's asserting a feudal relationship as a way to kind of shake somebody else down and force them to pay. But when you look at that, the feudalism, those feudal relationships are intensely local. So it's a way that it's important to know in general that that's happening, but it's maybe not necessarily a big world history topic. So, what does this mean then with the new AP World Modern? Well, I think the new AP World Modern course presents some real opportunities for talking about a global Middle Ages. I think the idea of a global tapestry, which some people have made fun of, other people kind of like. Are there students out there? Are your teachers, did they use this phrase, global tapestry? I think some teachers will just continue to use the old units. Some will embrace the new units. Or teachers are using this phrase global tapestry with the kids, or are you just not? I don't think there's anything wrong with the metaphor of a tapestry, except that it's kind of static. And what's good about that is you've got the global tapestry in your class. The good thing about it is it does, create, there's 7 units or topics in there, I think. And then so it does show these different parts of the world. So I think the new curriculum creates this opportunity by kind of explicitly saying there's things happening in these different parts of the world. But there are also gaps. And so as a teacher, I plan to fill these gaps. And the thing to know as a teacher or a student is that students can use examples that aren't it's there, right? Yeah, right. I think that's basically what I'll do. That it's there, but I mean, it is what it is. Um, the things that are missing, kids can still use as evidence in their essays. So, the course and exam description shows like the floor, like you should do, these are things that could be there. Something not being in the curriculum, like say exchange in the Americas, um, that doesn't, um, those things being missing. That means it's not going to be in a multiple choice question. Like there won't be a multiple choice question on an exchange in the Americas, but a student could still definitely use that as an essay example, and it would still count if it's accurate. That makes sense. So it wouldn't be the stimulus, but it would still be possible evidence that people could use. So for students out there, anything that you're learning that connects into some of the big ideas of the class, that could be useful. So remember, the thing with this course is you don't have to know everything. You just have to know something. So learn some things that fit in. But the reason why I'd say it marginalizes the Americas is because the Americas and then Africa are just listed as developing states, or they're not listed as like developing in general, which I think is quite odd. And then the one barrier I think that the new curriculum presents, if people are using those units, is the next unit's exchange. Unit two, that's important. And there's some good material in there. But one thing I think we need to be aware of is how that kind of framing silos, like separates off exchange from other parts of history. So I don't really know how much sense it makes to talk about a place like Southeast Asia without exchange just being right at the heart of it. It doesn't quite make sense to talk about some of these areas and then talk about exchange. Like exchange is part of them, it's not something else that's happening. And that's part of the idea of a global Middle Ages. This summer, I tweeted out some things and I later blogged about this. And this is where I noticed that, where it said that peoples in the Americas are only building states, and then the other parts of the world are listed as developing. Now that's probably semantic, but in a sense, but it's also kind of an odd choice. And I would encourage teachers to give Africa and the Americas the full treatment in this time period. All right, I'm going to pause for a moment. If people have any questions about those ideas or pushback or suggestions for things to do in terms of not focusing too much on the European Middle Ages. You can always park those questions right there and ask a question. So, another way to be sure that we're doing things globally is to take things that are important. I'm going to use one example and then pan out from there to see and look at other, wider parts of it. So, one example that I have linked in the resources is has to do with the East Africa coast in Swahili, the Swahili coast. Ooh. All right. Charlie asked a good question, which I think I probably should have addressed sooner. So thank you, Charlie. And that is the what do we mean when we say the Middle Ages? Well, people will mean different things, and it's going to mean different things in different parts of the world. In the world history curriculum, it's like 600 to 1450 CE. So that was the old period three. Um, that group of scholars from Britain who got together, they went all the way back to 300, and 300 would be the fall of the Han Dynasty, or it'd be a little bit after that. In China, they think of the Middle Ages as being from like the end of the Han Dynasty until the end of the Song Dynasty, with the Mongol invasion. That's their Middle Ages. Generally speaking, people think of the Middle Ages in Europe as ending in 1450, about, or 1550. Although so that would be like Columbus, and then also the period of the High Renaissance and culture changing. Although a lot of medieval historians of Europe would say the Middle Ages didn't really end until industrialization, for you to look at it that way. So there's in different places you might come up with different answers for things. But I would say in general, people are going to mean about the 600s through to about 1500, give or take on that. And so for us, it's unit zero. If a teacher's doing that, are people doing unit zeros out there, or maybe you're calling it something different? The pre, like before the unit start, and then that first time period, 1200 to 1450. And so that includes a lot of continuities. So one thing that AP World History classes will definitely cover is um, the Indian Ocean exchange. And so I think a couple of ways that we can make that more global. So, and how do you very global is by bringing in East Africa. And there's a lesson that I have linked here. I'm curious, what do you regret, Genevieve? You regret going too fast or going or including it at all? Do you miss some of the things? I feel like I'm going to miss some things. As I mentioned, today's day 2 of school for me. This is a lesson that I developed that brings in East Africa. And if you click, you can see, and it does two different things. Students learn some Swahili, and they take a look at the Swahili language and some of the words that have come into Swahili from other languages, and then they compare that to the source with Ibn Battuta. And so the Indian Ocean is something that goes along that started a long time ago. So it's kind of peeking back at Genevieve's question here, and I can see what you'd mean there. I do wonder about that. Today I did, well, like I said, we just started. So I did a little Neolithic revolution. It's like, well, if I just blow through this, how much will kids actually remember and make some sort of connection? So I think we'll all kind of see, maybe next year might wind up bumping that out a little more, my pre unit zero, before 1200 material. The Swahili city states really peak in their use and their influence around 1000, but they certainly continue until the Portuguese come and conquer some of them, and then later Swahili people retake some of them, and Omani merchants take some of them. But this is really a way to bring East Africa into the conversation. So I'd invite people to check that out. On the other side of the Indian Ocean, so again, this is the idea that if we pan out, we'll see more of what's happening. Obviously, you should be talking about monsoons and merchants and India and China and Europe are all important here. But then I think bringing Southeast Asia into it is rewarding in a couple ways. First of all, there's some terrific visuals. Now, I'm lucky, one of my teaching partners who teaches the course, she was at Angkor Wat last month, so we have some great pictures of that. But you can see here both the local and the interregional. So I think that the Southeast Asia is a great place to take a look at how the local and the interregional, how they interact with each other. So here, the reason I have where ice agriculture there is Kenneth Hall, who wrote the book that I took the article from earlier. Kenneth Hall talks about how, without this surplus of agriculture production, that these monuments in like Java and here, the Khmer state at Angkor, that it wouldn't be possible without that surplus to do that. So you can still have to talk about the local. It's not just that these Indian religious ideas showed up there and then that caused people to make things. Well, there needed to be a state. I used this photo of Angkor Wat. I think it's good to use because it shows the water, how like the engineering that was part of this. This is a hydraulic engineering monument to that, moving the water around and getting it in the right spot. Then additionally, you can see those influences here. We see a Javanese king who's been represented with, Hindu gods as a way to try to elevate his status as part of the Majapahit Empire. So I think Southeast Asia is a place where we can use visuals with students, or students, you can look at the visuals in that part of the book and see, okay, what does this picture show how can we see local things and how can we also see exchange? It's from that Twitter feed there, like the medieval Indonesia, showing compound bows in Java, and then sort of this is how might they have gotten there? This compound bows do originate in a lot of different places around the world. Again, there's a lot of really great visuals to use for this part of the world. And there were texts that, and a lot of them were written on palm leaves, so they've disintegrated. It's like parchment for the win, in terms of documents from places in Western Europe, whereas in India and Southeast Asia, a lot of that stuff is perishable. So there's less textual evidence. Okay. Might consider what are other places where we could apply this idea of panning out, or if we're looking at something that we know we're already going to cover, how can we broaden our gaze to see more of the world as part of that? The idea of going global then is, how do we try to include some of these parts of the world that wind up as, in the gap, and so they're not necessarily, or they're limited in the tapestry. And again, I think there's some great images we can use. I would encourage people to talk about or learn about exchange networks in the Americas. This is a fantastic image I've only recently come to use. So this was made by Aztec artisans and was given to Cortez. Somehow the British got a hold of it. It's in the British Museum. These things happened. But it has turquoise, and that turquoise is from outside of the Valley of Mexico. There's also oyster shells are part of the shine there. And so the material itself shows this kind of exchange. Plus, it's pretty cool looking. I mean, one of the things we should do in this class is look at cool things. So we can talk about the exchange there. We have Evan Little is going to be doing a stream on exchange in the Americas as part of this project coming up. Maybe not next week, but the week after. So I think when he's going to do that. So Cahokia is another place. It's in the Global Middle Ages project. So if you follow that call to action, or it's in the resources, and take a look at, there's some things on Cahokia there, city, near East St. Louis in the United States, just down the Mississippi River from me. I'm in St. Paul, Minnesota. I think Ethiopia would be another spot. Again, for students, if you see this picture in your book and the chapter on Africa in this time period, you might take a moment to think about how that shows connections to other places. These are the oldest, this is single stone buildings in the world, of these churches that are carved into the ground, which is not just architectural, it's also theological, the Christian idea of death and rebirth, that people go down into the ground to go to church. There's some very interesting things to talk about there again. And that's one of the places that is in the global tapestry. Are there any other places that people are looking forward to studying or learning about, or people are looking forward to teaching? Those of you who are teaching the class right now? Maybe outside of the Europe, India, China, which are still very important, of course, but making it global, like including some other spots. Where else are you looking forward to learning about? People going to do Oceania? People who are teachers? I know Oceania. The only time the word Oceania appears in the new course and exam description is on the map. So I haven't. I think I probably will do some wayfinding. Okay. The last topic. It's about emphasizing connections. Is another way to globalize things. And one way to do that is looking at travelers' tales. And there's a couple traveler stories that I've come across recently, and that I'm going to try to add into some that I've traditionally done, like Ibn Battuta and Marco Polo travel stories. Some of those Italian monks that go to China in the Middle Ages. If you click on these links and check out the other sources, and again, they're in the resources. The first one is one I came across when I was putting together a DBQ on the Mongols, and it's a fascinating account. So it's a Taoist master who was summoned to Central Asia by Genghis Khan to exchange ideas. And then the story is like he gets there, and and Genghis Khan says, "You're going to have to wait for a little bit. There's some bandits in the mountains that I need to deal with. I'll be back in 6 months." Now, I think there's two things to point out with kids, like or as students. Like, I don't want to be the bandit that Genghis Khan clears his schedule 6 months for to come and deal with. Kind of shows you like this other part of Genghis Khan, putting down banditry. But of course, being a Taoist, the master's like, I've got time. And then they have this exchange, which is recorded. So it's very interesting and would be a good way for students or teachers to see the religious pluralism of the Mongols. Now, I know that, well, some students have probably gotten to the Mongols, some haven't, but the Mongols, despite being very brutal militarily, were very tolerant of religions. And tolerant isn't even quite strong enough. They supported pluralism. There's a lot of mixed religious marriages within the Mongol Khans, so Christians, Buddhists, Muslims, traditional shamanists, so all kinds of things. So that's a source I've really enjoyed using, and I think that you can read an excerpt from it like in class in like 15 minutes. The other thing that came across through the hashtag Global Middle Ages is this Journeys to the West, which is a story map. And what a story map is a GIS, like geographic information systems um, graphic where the map, has text embedded in it, so you can kind of see the story of this journey that these people made. So as you go down the translations done by this professor, so Xiao Yun Yang is a professor, Central Asian professor, or professor of Central Asia, and he is translated these travelers' tales. These two travelers who head out from China and go west and southwest, and I wind up going through Iran, and you can trace the journey. And there's kind of two things. One would be it's a good way for students to kind of experience the text to kind of see where the places are. And then the second thing, something I haven't done yet, but which I would like to do, and that is to have students create these story maps. And I don't know if anybody in the audience has done that or been assigned to do that, but students could take any of these other travelers' tales, including Ibn Battuta, Marco Polo, but there are many of them from the Middle Ages, and then put them on one of these maps. And then the information is there. So that's another resource that I think would be great to use with students. People could take a look at. Mm. Oh yeah, I see your question here. The transition into the early modern. Well, I think Dylan, I think the key thing with that is not to treat like the European developments as being part of the sort of a European tunnel of time where feudalism leads to the Renaissance, leads to the scientific revolution, leads to the Enlightenment, leads to modernity. There's a lot of ways that that story is just incorrect. And so instead, what I think we need to do is if we're treating the Middle Ages globally to begin with, then the things that are more European in the modern, they'll still emerge and they'll be clear as changes. But it's important for us to understand things that were happening in the Middle Ages as context for those developments that happened later. Like it wasn't in an inevitable chain of events that leads to modernity. The other thing I think that's important with that is not to overemphasize European dominance in the early modern. So if you take like the Swahili coast as an example, it's a place I've done some research. So the Portuguese come in and they build this Fort Jesus or Jesus in Portuguese, in what's in Mombasa. And and they take and they put cannons up in the forts. They take over trade in and out of Mombasa by forcing people to pay protection money to them, basically, to come in and out. So that's imperialism, right? But they don't control the hinterland. They don't control the land around Fort Jesus. And like two or three times in the 15, or after they build the fort in the late 1500s, in the 16 and 1700s, they lose the Portuguese lose control of the fort. So local Swahili people take the fort over at some point. There's like a rebellion. They're like, no, we'll run the fort. Omani, traders come in and they take the fort over. And the Portuguese get control back of it. So it's not to minimize Portuguese control and say that didn't happen. It's a little bit like the DBQ last year for teachers. That DBQ really did make, even though it put the key in Africa. But besides that, it did a good job of showing how that Portuguese control was localized in certain areas. So I guess my answer would be that we have to just kind of globalize both ends of that equation. It's not until 1800 that Europeans are really able to dominate most of South and East Asia in any kind of way. Like, what is it? The George McCartney mission is 1793. The English send this guy to the Chinese emperor, and they have all these things. They're like, here's things we want to trade with you. And the emperor's like, we don't want any of this stuff. Like, we don't need any of this stuff. And of course, that's where the opium wars and opium trade comes in. It's all a way of saying that European dominance in the modern is really a 19th century thing. It's not a 16th century thing. And as Americans knowing about the Great Dying and disease in the Americas, um, and the way that Europeans came in and then were able to establish dominance right away, I think it distorts how we see what actually happened in other parts of the world, where it was a real halting, fits and starts kind of process. And then after World War I, it starts to fall apart. So we're really looking at about 115 years, and that's real and it's important. But I think it's also important for us to keep that in perspective. Kind of a long answer, but thanks, Dylan. I know that you are curious about those kind of things. The book I'm reading right now that does a really good job of framing that too is Robert Mark's Origins of the Modern World. It's only a couple hundred pages, and there's a lot of economic and environmental history in there. I think if people are interested in kind of getting a big picture view of this, a lot of people recommended that book to me, and I'm glad. Another place that we can see connections is China, and I have linked here a great resource from Asia for Educators. Some people might have seen this silk scroll, which is huge, and then if you go there, you can zoom in on it and see these different details. But it shows the urbanization in Song China, like the urban wealth that existed there. That sort of wealthy, most productive. So did your teachers show that to you, or I'm going to show it to my students this year? A picture. It's really, yeah, it's fantastic. Yeah. So what have you done with it, Mrs. L? Yeah, the materials that go with it, those are linked there. You could really look at it and explore. Oh, using you mean the How Do I Feel About the Marx book? Genevieve explaining it to students. I'm not sure which thing you're. Oh, hard copies. So they break down the text and like annotate the text, and then they go and see what it was. Oh, good. Yeah, I might steal that. That sounds good. In your question here, Genevieve, I'm not sure what you think about assigning it. I do know people who've used parts of the Marx book as um as supplements, and I know some people like Bram Hubble, that's their textbook, and then they use a lot of outside sources. But I know some other people who have used excerpts from it. Probably depends on how old your students are, but I definitely think I work with 11th graders, and I definitely think they could read, like chunks of it, and then kind of see it really frames things in an interesting way. All right. For other folks, if you haven't checked out this scroll, yeah, right, yeah, that's. I'm looking. I've like pointed kids to it before, but this year I think I want to take like a day and just like dig into this source and let kids do that. Which is one of the advantages of the changes is that we have some more time like that. Oh, oh, all right. I think we're already kind of doing this. Questions, comments, and suggestions for other places to see kind of connections. I didn't do too much with South Asia, like in things that I've brought together for this that people good resource search then sets up and starts to negotiate with the Mughal Empire. The Mughal Empire is like 25 times the population of England. It takes by 1776, the East India Companies gained some authority, but again, we have to kind of delay. We can't rush to that. We can't rush to that time period. But that would be an area where I have some room for growth. Would be the medieval South Asia. I know a little bit, I guess, about the Delhi Sultanate, but it's like what I just did there. I just rushed to the Mughals, like rushed through the medieval to the early modern. Well, that is all I have for this presentation. Thank you for coming. I'll be here for a moment if you want to put any other questions in the chat or into the ask a question. You can also be in touch with me in other places. Like I said, for students, the students who are here, we have some great student-led streams coming. Be kind of the opposite of this. Was this kind of a teacher thinking about what other teachers might be interested in seeing? But if you turn in tomorrow night, Skylar was a student. She's in 10th grade and she's going to be talking about what her student life was like in this class, and she has positive examples from her notes, and she has notes that didn't work as well, so she'll do both things. Oh, thank you, Mrs. L, that's great. um and so we have that, and then on Friday she and Varun will just be answering questions. So if you have questions about how to study, it could be a question about something in particular. These kids did really well in the class, so you could ask them content, you could ask them about studying. And then we do have skill sessions with Carolyn Castellanos and James Zucker coming up. Oh, I'm so glad. And be in touch. Like I said, I'll do another one of these in a month and we'll bump it out through the usual channels, and it'll be the same kind of thing, like a different way of thinking about it, and then a bunch of suggestions. So it's been nice interacting with you tonight. So I'm going to close the stream then, and I look forward to seeing you all down the road.